Leah sat on the edge of the bed, her white satin gown crumpled around her legs. Hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles turned pale. The ornate bridal suite was silent except for the ticking of the grand clock on the wall and her uneven breathing. She had locked the door behind her the moment they arrived. She was not ready for what waited on the other side. Bang! The door shook with the force of a fist. "Leah, open this door!" Jace's voice was calm at first, but the threat beneath it made her stomach knot. More pounding, this time louder. "I said open it, now!" Her breath hitched. She backed away from the door, step by step, until her spine met the cold wooden frame of the dresser behind her. The reality of it all was sinking in fast. This was her wedding night. Her husband was outside the door, and she had no idea who he truly was. "Leah, if you don't open this door, I swear I'll break it down." Her fingers shook as they hovered above her lips. She had dreamt of love once, of a man who would look into her eyes like she was a world worth protecting. Not a deal made over a debt. She closed her eyes. The image of her father kneeling, humiliated, in Jace's office flashed before her. The man who had gambled away everything. The man who, desperate and ashamed, had agreed to the arrangement. One signature and your debt disappears. Just one. That was what Jace had said. Her father hadn't hesitated. Neither had Jace. She was the price. Leah remembered the moment she had first seen him. Sharp black suit. Gray eyes that looked like they saw everything and judged it anyway. Beautiful, intimidating, unreachable. She had stood in that cold office, barely 19, heart-pounding, clutching the edges of her coat while he sized her up like she was a car he was buying. And he had smiled. A virgin, perfect. The sound of wood splintering jolted her back. "Don't do this," she whispered to herself. "Don't break down." She grabbed the chair from the vanity and wedged it under the handle. It was useless, really. If he truly wanted to come in, nothing would stop him. But it was the only defense she had. Another crash. This time the doorknob twisted violently. "I paid for this marriage. I won't be made a fool on our wedding night." Her heart pounded against her ribs. It felt like betrayal, wrapped in velvet. She could still hear the music from the reception echoing in her mind, the false congratulations, the laughter of people who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Jace had smiled at her all day. He had touched her back, possessively, kissed her forehead for the cameras. Now he wanted to collect what he thought was his. "Please," she whispered, "just give me time." Silence. For one long moment, there was only the faint ticking of the clock again. Then his voice came softer, quieter. "I've waited long enough, Leah." She curled into herself, wrapping her arms around her knees, tears rolling down her cheeks without sound. This wasn't love. This wasn't even lust. It was control, and it was terrifying. And in that moment, with her gown still clinging to her body, and the man she had just married pounding on her door, Leah realized something that made her blood turn cold. She was not a wife. She was a prisoner in a dress. Leah had never imagined her life would come to this. Growing up, she had been a quiet dreamer, always scribbling stories in the margins of her textbooks, always drawn to gentle silences and the kind of love that unfolded like slow sunrises. She wasn't naive, at least that's what she had told herself. But nothing in her 22 years had prepared her for a marriage built on contracts and control. Her father had once been a well-respected professor. known for his intelligence and quiet dignity. But somewhere along the way, dignity gave way to desperation. After losing his job and turning to gambling, he began accumulating debt with the kind of recklessness that only a man drowning would understand. Her mother, already weakened by a heart condition, tried to hold the family together, but it was Leah who carried most of the burden. She had dropped out of her final year at university, putting her psychology degree on hold to work at a local bookstore while taking care of her mother at home. It was during one of those bleak evenings that her father came home with trembling hands and a proposal that would alter her life forever. "There's someone," he had said, unable to meet her eyes. "He can fix everything." The man he spoke of was Jace Hayward. Leah had heard his name, whispered like myth, young, powerful, ruthless. A real estate mogul who had built his empire from nothing but ambition and precision. He was the type of man fathers warned their daughters about, but for hers he had become a lifeline. When Leah first met him, she had been expecting cruelty in his expression, arrogance in his tone. But what she saw was something far more dangerous calm. Jace was coldly composed, as if the chaos around him never touched his skin. He studied her with detached curiosity, then placed a contract on the table with an almost casual nod. "You'll marry me," he said. "In return, your family walks free." Leah had stared at the paper, then at her father. Her first instinct was to say no, to scream, to run. But she didn't, because the image of her mother coughing blood into a tissue haunted her more than any stranger's eyes. She had signed her name in silence. The wedding happened 2 weeks later. It was perfect by every external standard. White roses, violin quartet, designer gown. But inside she felt like she was attending her own funeral. Everyone assumed she was lucky that she had landed the most eligible bachelor in the city. No one knew she was barely able to breathe. There was no affection from Jace, no warmth. Just polite gestures rehearsed for photographers. He didn't kiss her on the lips. He kissed her temple like claiming property. There had been a time when Leah believed in love. Back when she was still in school, she had fallen for a boy named Evan. He had been kind, or so she thought. They had shared books, dreams, kisses under rainstorms. Until the night she discovered he had been seeing her closest friend behind her back. That betrayal had crushed something delicate inside her. Since then, Leah had built walls, wrapped herself in silence, convinced that love was just a trick with a pretty face. Yet even that heartbreak had not prepared her for what Jace was. He didn't shout or insult her, he didn't hit, but everything about him screamed control. His eyes followed her too closely. His hand on her back never felt comforting. He never asked how she felt. He only reminded her of the agreement. "You're my wife now. I've fulfilled my part. It's time you fulfill yours." The words replayed in her mind every night louder than the ticking clock. It wasn't about sex. It was about power, and she knew it. What unsettled her most wasn't just what he wanted from her, but how little. He seemed to think she had a right to say no. Every part of her was clenched like a fist, waiting to be hit, even though the blow never came. And that night, when she locked the bedroom door, on their wedding night, it wasn't rebellion. It was survival. As she sat there on the cold floor of a room built for fairy tales, Leah began to wonder if anyone would ever truly see her not as a virgin, not as a bride, not as a price, but as a person with a voice, a soul, a choice. She hadn't chosen Jace. She had chosen to save her family, but deep down a fire, sparked in her chest, small but growing. One day she would choose herself. The morning after the wedding, Leah woke up still fully dressed in her gown, her back aching from sleeping on the hard floor beside the bed. The sunlight had filtered through the heavy curtains, painting golden streaks across the marble tiles. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she heard footsteps outside the door, slow, deliberate. She sat up quickly, her heart already racing. The doorknob turned, but the lock held firm. Jace did not knock this time. He simply stood there silent. She could hear his breath steady and patient, as if he was used to waiting until people broke on their own. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "You locked me out on our wedding night. Is this how you plan to start our marriage?" Leah said nothing. She kept her arms wrapped around herself, not trusting her voice. He chuckled lowly. "You're braver than I expected." And then he walked away. The days that followed were no easier. They lived in the same house but in different worlds. Jace didn't touch her again, not physically. But his presence followed her like a shadow. His eyes were always on her, calculating, watching for weakness. He controlled everything: what she wore, when she ate, who she could speak to. He didn't allow her to leave the estate unless accompanied by one of his staff. She felt like a painting trapped in a museum, admired but never truly seen. He wasn't violent, he wasn't cruel, but he was never kind. There were moments when she caught glimpses of something else, something almost human. He would sit by the piano in the study, late at night, playing melodies, too soft to belong to someone so sharp. He would stare out the window for hours, unmoving, as if lost in a memory he could never speak of. But whenever Leah tried to ask, his walls rose like steel. "Don't try to understand me, just do your part," he had said once. She didn't try again. Jonah was the only person who treated her like a human being. He was Jace's longtime friend and business partner, a quiet man with thoughtful eyes and a calm presence. He came to the house often, sometimes for meetings, sometimes just to check on things. One afternoon, when Jace was away on a trip, Jonah found her in the greenhouse, kneeling beside a dying rosebush. She hadn't realized he was watching her until he spoke. "You talk to them when no one else is around." She looked up, startled. "Plants don't judge," she replied softly. He knelt beside her. "Neither do some people." For a while they sat in silence. Then he said, "I know what it looks like from the outside. I know Jace isn't easy." Leah didn't respond. Jonah continued, voice gentle. "He wasn't always like this. There was a time he laughed, believed in people. Then someone he loved broke him. It wasn't just betrayal, it was public humiliating. She left him for his own brother." Leah's fingers dug into the soil. That explained the coldness, the need to control, but it didn't excuse it. "That doesn't mean he gets to own me," she said. Jonah nodded. "No, it doesn't, but he doesn't realize that yet. He thinks love is something you secure, not something you earn." That night she wrote in her journal for the first time in weeks. She poured out everything: her fear, her anger, her exhaustion. She wrote about the way Jace looked at her like she was a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. She wrote about the silence that stretched between them like a chasm. And she wrote about the memory of Evan, her first love, the boy, who had promised her forever but chose her best friend instead. That betrayal had cracked something in her, but this marriage was slowly crushing whatever was left. A few days later, Jace returned from his business trip. He came into the dining room where Leah sat eating dinner alone. Without a word, he sat across from her and began eating. She kept her eyes on her plate, pretending not to notice how his gaze burned into her. "You're not wearing the necklace I bought you," he said suddenly. She looked up. "I didn't feel like it." He set his fork down. "You belong to me, Leah. That's not optional." She stood, pushing her chair back. "No, I don't belong to anyone." He rose slowly. "You're my wife. You paid off a debt. That doesn't give you ownership over my body or my choices." His jaw tightened. "Don't mistake patience for weakness." "And don't mistake silence for consent," she fired back. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned away. "Go to your room." She didn't. She left the house that night. It wasn't a grand escape. No dramatic music or midnight sprint. Just a quiet departure. She told the guard she needed fresh air and walked past the gates before anyone could stop her. She didn't take anything except her journal and a single change of clothes. She took a bus to a town 2 hours away and checked into a small motel under a fake name. For the first time in weeks, she breathed. She spent the next days in silence, letting the world slow down. She found a bookstore hiring part-time help and took the job. She read, she walked, she healed. And each night she wrote, in her journal, on napkins, on the backs of receipts. She wrote until her hand ached and her heart felt lighter. She thought of Jace sometimes, wondered if he noticed she was gone, wondered if he even cared. She didn't expect to hear from him. She didn't expect anything at all. Until the day a letter arrived at the bookstore addressed to her real name in handwriting, she recognized instantly. Inside was no apology, no demands, just a single line. "I was wrong. You don't belong to me. You never did." She read the line over and over again, unsure what to feel. For the first time, he hadn't tried to control her. For the first time, he had let her go. Leah folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she did. She stared at it for a long time, the words echoing in her mind. "I was wrong. You don't belong to me. You never did." She had not expected that from him. In fact, she hadn't expected to hear from him at all. And maybe that was what unsettled her the most. It wasn't the content of the letter, but the fact that it was so quiet, so unlike the Jace she had known. The man who had cornered her with contracts and silence. The man who watched her like a hawk and spoke to her as if affection was a language he never learned. Now he had written her a sentence that asked for nothing. That alone was a shift she couldn't ignore. For days she kept herself busy, organizing shelves, making tea for customers, pretending that her world hadn't tilted just a bit from that letter. But at night, when the lights were out and the town had gone still, she would sit by the window of her small rented room and wonder what had changed, what had made him write those words. She didn't write back, not because she was angry, but because she wasn't ready. Then one morning Jonah appeared at the door of the bookstore. He stood with his hands tucked into his coat, looking older and more tired than she remembered. The bell above the door chimed when he stepped in, and she froze. Their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. He didn't smile, and neither did she. "Can we talk?" he asked. She nodded and led him to the back, where they sat at a small table usually reserved for customers sipping coffee. Jonah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the wood. "He's been in therapy for the past month, voluntarily, twice a week." Leah blinked. That wasn't what she expected to hear. Jonah continued, voice low. He told me to find you, not to bring you back, just to tell you the truth, all of it. She folded her arms, skeptical but curious. Jonah took a deep breath. Jace was 8 when his mother left. She didn't take anything except her name. No warning, no goodbye. She disappeared and never came back. His father remarried a year later to a woman who believed discipline was more important than affection. Jace spent most of his childhood being measured and punished. No one ever hugged him. No one ever asked him how he felt. And when he finally found someone who did, Miranda, she cheated on him with his own brother. Publicly. It was in the tabloids. Everyone knew. Leah said nothing, her fingers curling around her mug. He learned 2 things from all of that, Jonah said. That love disappears, and that control is safer than trust. Leah let the words sink in. So he decided to buy me like a possession instead of risking affection. Jonah nodded. It was wrong. He knows that now. That's why he let you go. Leah looked down. Why are you really here, Jonah? He hesitated. Because I think you're the only person he's ever wanted to love right. And the only person he doesn't know how to. She didn't respond. She wasn't sure if she could believe it. But she also couldn't deny the tremor in her chest, the small part of her that wanted to see for herself. That night she opened her journal and began to write again. Not about pain or fear this time, but about memory. She wrote about the boy at the piano in the study, about the letter written in soft, uneven script, about the sound of her own voice saying no and being heard. The next week she received a package at the bookstore. It was small, wrapped in plain paper. Inside was a copy of a book, her book, the one she had written in pieces on napkins and receipts. The title read, Not Yours to Own. A note was tucked inside the cover. I published it for you. Under your name. No edits, no conditions, just your truth. She pressed the book to her chest, her throat tightening. For the first time, Jace had done something for her without expecting anything in return. He had taken something sacred and shared it with the world because he believed in it, believed in her. That night she called the number on the card he had left in the package. He picked up on the second ring. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then she said, You published my pain. His voice was quiet. I wanted people to hear your story, and I needed to stop hiding from mine. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything, just listened to the sound of his breath on the other end. Before hanging up, he said, I won't ask you to come back, but if you ever want to talk, you know where to find me. Days passed. She signed books. She got letters from women who had never felt seen until they read her words. She cried reading their stories. And one afternoon, while standing at the back of a crowded bookstore during a reading event, she looked up and saw him, Jace, standing in the far corner, not approaching, just watching. His suit was simpler than before, his posture less rigid, his eyes softer. He didn't move toward her, didn't demand her attention. He just stood there, a quiet reminder that sometimes even the most broken people can learn to be gentle. She stepped down from the small stage and walked through the crowd until they stood face to face. Neither spoke. He didn't reach for her. She didn't flinch. The space between them was not filled with tension anymore. It was filled with choice. I never hated you, she said softly. I know, he replied. I hated myself enough for both of us. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Walk with me." They left the bookstore together. No cameras, no audience, no contracts. Just two people walking side by side into something unknown. But this time it felt real. They walked without speaking, turning corners as the city slowly emptied into twilight. The last streaks of orange faded into muted blue, and streetlights began to flicker on one by one. Leah's hands stayed at her sides, free, untethered. Jace kept a few steps behind her, as if afraid to get too close. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was hesitant, delicate, like a paper bridge suspended between two cliffs. She stopped at a bench near the riverside, gesturing for him to sit. He hesitated for a moment, then lowered himself beside her. The river moved quietly before them, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of wind. Leah leaned back, eyes forward. "I didn't think I'd see you again," she said. Jace answered without turning his head. "I didn't think I deserved to be seen." She glanced at him. "But you came anyway?" He gave a short nod. "To prove that I could show up without taking." For a while neither of them spoke. The wind teased strands of her hair across her cheek, and Jace resisted the urge to brush it back. He was learning restraint in the presence of someone he once thought he could own. "Why did you publish my book?" she asked, her voice soft. "Because the world needed to hear your story," he replied. "And because I knew you wouldn't let me back into your life unless I stopped trying to control it." Leah looked down at her hands. "You hurt me, I know. You made me feel small, trapped, like I wasn't a person." His voice was low, raw. "I was terrified of losing you, of being unloved again. So I gripped tighter and became the very thing I feared. I was never yours to keep," she said. "I know that now." "Why now?" she asked. "Why change?" He exhaled slowly. "Because when you left, the silence was louder than any argument we'd ever had. For the first time, I wasn't angry. I was ashamed. You didn't yell, you didn't fight. You just walked away. And I realized you were the first person in my life who did that without trying to destroy me." Leah turned to him, her gaze steady. "I didn't leave to teach you a lesson. I left to save myself." "You did both," he replied. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying not to forget that." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected rehearsed apologies, grand gestures. But what she found was something much rarer: humility. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "Your journal," he said, placing it on the bench between them. "You left it behind. I read it. Every page I cried." Her heart thudded. "You had no right, I know, but I didn't read it as a husband. I read it as a man, trying to understand the damage he caused." She stared at the notebook, then back at him. "What did you learn?" "That love is not earned by control," he said. "That silence is not strength. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away. And that you were never afraid of me. You were afraid of losing yourself in someone who didn't know how to value you." Leah's throat tightened. She hadn't expected her words to reach him. Not like this. She looked at him closely, searching for the man she had feared. But he wasn't there. In his place was someone older, softer still, flawed but trying. He stood slowly. "I won't ask you for anything, not your forgiveness, not your heart. I just wanted you to know that I see you now, not as my wife, not as the girl I bought, as Leah, a woman who walked away with grace and taught me how to do the same." He turned to leave his hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. She watched him go, her mind racing. This wasn't how she had imagined their reunion. There was no passionate apology, no sweeping embrace, just truth. And somehow it was more powerful. The next morning she woke to find another letter slipped under her door. No envelope, just a single folded page. It read, "If you ever want to see the stars from the cabin I built in Vermont. The door is open. I'll be there, not waiting, just living and hoping." Jay, for days she carried the note in her coat pocket, touched it when the world felt heavy, reread it when she doubted herself. 1 week later, she closed the bookstore for the weekend and boarded a train heading north. The ride was long quiet. As the landscape changed from city streets to forests and mountains, she felt something loosen in her chest. She arrived near sunset. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a pine-covered hill, smoke curling gently from the chimney. She stepped onto the porch and hesitated, then knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Jace stood there, no suit, no mask, just jeans, a sweater, and eyes that held fear and hope in equal measure. He stepped aside, letting her in. The inside was warm, simple, filled with wood and soft light. Books lined the walls. Music played faintly in the background. She walked in, slowly looking around, then turned to him. "Is this real?" she asked. He nodded. "Only if you want it to be." "I don't want to go back to the way things were," she said. "Neither do I," he replied. "Then what is this A beginning?" he said. "Not a continuation, not a fix, just a choice." She stood in silence for a moment, then walked toward the fireplace and sat down. He joined her. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. In that silence there was understanding. They talked for hours about their fears, their failures, the things they were still learning. And when the fire died down, Leah leaned her head against his shoulder. Not because he asked, but because she wanted to. Outside the stars began to appear, and inside something began again. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. The days at the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm that neither of them spoke about aloud. Leah would wake early, step out onto the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watch the mist rise from the trees. Jace would make coffee without asking how she liked it, but somehow it was always right. They spent most of their mornings in silence, reading writing or walking among the trees. There were no declarations, no expectations, only the simplicity of coexistence. And yet, in that simplicity, something profound began to unfold. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Leah sat by the fire with her journal open in her lap. Jace sat across from her, his gaze distant. She looked up, studying his face in the flickering light. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He hesitated. "My mother." Leah closed her journal and set it aside. "You never talk about her. There's not much to say. She left when I was 8. No note, no explanation, just disappeared." His voice was even, but his eyes betrayed a grief that hadn't aged. "I used to sit by the window every day after school, hoping she'd walk up the driveway. I memorized the sound of footsteps on gravel, but it was never hers." Leah didn't interrupt. She knew what it meant for him to say these things out loud. He continued. "After she left, I stopped crying. My stepmother said boys who cried grew up weak. My father didn't argue. I thought if I became strong enough, people wouldn't leave. So I worked Built Wall's success control. And when Miranda left me for my brother, it just confirmed everything I already believed. That love was a transaction, that emotions were liabilities, that possession was safer than vulnerability." Leah watched him closely. Do you still believe that Jace met her gaze? I'm trying not to. Every day. She nodded slowly, then reached across the space between them and took his hand. It was the first time she had touched him since the wedding. He didn't move, didn't tighten his grip, just held her hand as if afraid to break something sacred. You know, she said, her voice gentle, I used to think that love meant giving yourself away. That if I didn't give enough, I wouldn't be worthy. But it doesn't work like that. Real love doesn't ask you to disappear. He squeezed her hand. I don't want you to disappear. I just want you here, as you are. The fire crackled softly between them. It wasn't a grand moment. No music swelled, but something shifted. A quiet kind of commitment was made, not through words but through presence. The next morning they drove into the nearby town for groceries. Leah had almost forgotten what it felt like to walk beside someone in public without needing to play a role. They laughed about a crooked stack of fruit in the market, shared coffee in a tiny cafe, and talked about everything except the past. But while browsing through the bookstore, Leah's eyes caught a familiar cover. Her own book, not yours to own. It sat on the shelf between titles written by women she admired, authors who had shaped her. Her name on that cover no longer felt like a reminder of pain. It felt like proof that healing had taken root. As she reached for a copy, a young woman nearby noticed and gasped, Wait, you're Leah Monroe. Leah turned startled. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Your book saved me. I didn't know anyone else had felt like I did. I read it in one night. It changed how I saw myself. Leah didn't know what to say. She had never expected her words to reach beyond her own catharsis. But here was someone real and trembling who had found light through her darkness. Thank you, the woman whispered. Thank you for surviving. Leah hugged her, not because she had to, but because they both needed it. Later that evening, back at the cabin, Jace handed her a letter. This came for you last week. I didn't open it. She opened it slowly. It was from her mother. The handwriting was uneven but familiar. Her mother had read the book. And in the letter she apologized, not just for the marriage, but for the silence, for the years Leah had been told to endure, for the belief that a woman's value was measured by how much she could tolerate. The letter ended with a single line, You taught me how to be brave. Leah folded it gently, tears brimming. She looked at Jace. The world keeps surprising me. He smiled faintly. You keep surprising me. That night, as they sat under a sky littered with stars, Jace pulled something from his pocket, a ring, but not the one he had given her before. This one was simple. No diamonds, no labels, just a plain band. This isn't a proposal, he said quickly. It's a promise that I will never try to own you again, that I will choose you every day without expecting you to choose me back, that I will love you in the way you taught me love should feel. Leah took the ring, held it in her palm. You once told me you'd waited long enough, she said. That night I thought you were going to break me. I almost did, but you didn't. You let me go. And you came back, he said quietly, because I wanted to, not because I had to. She slipped the ring onto her middle finger, a symbol not of ownership, but of choice, of self. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't fall into bed or whisper promises they couldn't keep. They simply stayed close. Two people learning, unlearning, and beginning again. In the morning, Leah woke to find a note on the table beside her journal. It was in her handwriting. She had written it weeks ago, but never realized he'd seen it. It read, "I am not afraid of falling anymore, just afraid of forgetting how to stand." Beside it, Jace had scribbled one sentence beneath her words, "Then we'll stand together." Spring arrived slowly in Vermont, and with it came warmth, not just in the air but in the spaces Leah had once thought impossible to reclaim. The cabin, once a quiet place of pause, became a home they built together, day by day, without needing to label it. Leah continued writing her words, now carrying both the weight of the past and the gentleness of healing. She spoke at women's centers, answered letters from readers who found themselves reflected in her story. And for the first time, she did not shy away from being seen. Jace stayed steady beside her, never stepping in front, never trailing behind. He volunteered at shelters, started funding therapy programs for young men struggling with emotional trauma, and slowly the man who once used control as a shield became someone who believed that vulnerability was not weakness but a doorway. On the anniversary of their wedding, they didn't exchange gifts or stage anything elaborate. Instead, they returned to the small bookstore where she had first seen her book on a shelf. They sat in the back corner sipping coffee and laughing about how little they had understood about love back then. Leah reached for his hand across the table. "You know what I remember most about that night?" "Which one?" he asked. "The wedding night, the door, the fear." His expression shifted, pain flickering behind his eyes. "I remember it too, but it's not the fear I remember most," she said. "It's the moment I realized I could walk away, that I was allowed to." He looked at her silent, and now he asked, "Now I stay, not because I owe you anything, but because I choose you, freely, without fear." Every day he asked. "Some days I may forget," she said with a soft smile, "but I'll always remember how to come back to myself and to you." That evening they returned to the cabin. The air smelled like pine and earth. Leah stood on the porch watching the stars blink alive one by one. Jace came up behind her, wrapping a soft blanket around her shoulders. They didn't need to say anything. Some love stories aren't about burning passion or dramatic declarations. Some are about survival, about becoming, about learning how to stay without losing yourself. Leah had once been a girl who believed her worth depended on obedience, who had been bought, traded, silenced, but she was no longer that girl. She was a woman who had walked through fire and came out with her voice intact. And the man beside her was no longer the cold shadow who had tried to possess her. He was a man who had unraveled, rebuilt, and arrived, not perfect, but present. Their story was not a fairy tale. It was not about saving or being saved. It was about two broken people choosing each other with open eyes. And for Leah, that was more romantic than any fantasy. She turned to Jace and whispered, "Thank you for letting me leave." He answered, "Thank you for choosing to return." In the quiet of that mountain night, with no audience and no vows, just the soft hum of life being lived, Leah smiled. She was not a prisoner in a dress. She was not a woman bought and claimed. She was free, and she was loved, on her terms. That was the real beginning.